And now let's start with we'll share the Makorot, which hopefully you've, those of you who print out the Makorot in advance, you've had a chance to do that. And here we go. 1 second, so make sure it's slow coming up. One second. This is odd. Still not there.
Recording in progress.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So I don't know what happened.
No, we don't hear you.
Do you hear me now?
Now again we can.
But you don't see me, do you?
I do see you.
Okay, because I don't see myself. Oh, I know what happened here. Hold on. I will. Okay, fine. So my computer, as I was sharing the screen, decided it's not going to share the screen. And it's not going to only do that, it just stopped working. So I'm working off my telephone now, which means that I'm not able with my phone to share the screen and manipulate it. So I'll ask for those people who printed it, great. I will ask the Benot Sheirut if you could please put the Makorot on the screen for the people who are following on their computers. And I will try to work. I've printed out the Makorot as well, and I will be referring to numbers. And if people can, the share screen can move down with as I talk about the Makorot. I apologize for the technical difficulty. I don't know why my computer just decided to stop working, but that's the way it is. So I'm going to be speaking today about the limits of Kibud Reeim. That's the Makorot, or some thoughts on the limits, and it comes as we generally work in this year. We have we focus on the Parsha itself, and then see how things develop. And at the very beginning of the Parsha, or in the immediately after the burial of Sarah, we have the story of Abraham and the Eved. Abraham sending his servant, we know him as Eliezer, to go find a wife for Yitzchak. And the Torah, in the first Makor here, in Bereshit Perek Chav Daled, so the Torah tells us that Abraham Zaken ba b'yamim ve'Hashem berachet Abraham bakol. Abraham was older, and he had now been blessed with everything, and presumably what he hasn't been blessed with is he's been blessed with everything except. And what's the except? The except is that his 40-year-old son, for whom that God has promised, the Kibi Yitzchak Yikareh Lecha Zara, is unmarried, and there's no continuation, there's no continuity, and Abraham is troubled by this, and he calls the servant, and he makes the servant take the oath to not take a wife for Yitzchak from Benot Canaan, but rather to go to back to Haran. We're all familiar with the story. And then the rest of the Perek, it's one of the longest prakim in all of the Torah, 67 prakim, psukim. And at the end of the Perek, Rivka and Yitzchak meet, and and Yitzchak takes her into the tent of Sarah. Fine. Where is Yitzchak at the beginning of the story? In fact, and this is, I don't want to focus on this too much right now, but something for everyone to think about. Yitzchak and Avraham will have no interaction, direct interaction in the Torah from the time of the Akedah, the end of last week's Parsha, until the end of this week's Parsha, when he and Yishmael bury Avraham. In other words, there is what has occurred during that lengthy period, where we don't know exactly how long that is, because we don't know how old Yitzchak was at the Akedah. But even assuming we take the latest possible number, the 37, that he's 37 at the time of the Akedah, which would make Avraham 137. So that's 38 years where the Torah records absolutely no conversation. Yitzchak isn't mentioned as returning to Beersheba with Avraham. It's Vayashov Avraham el Beersheba. Only Avraham goes back, not Yitzchak. So there's and even here we last saw Avraham in Hebron, but yet the servant goes to the Negev, to Be'er Lachai Roi, to find Yitzchak. So there seems to be something going on, perhaps for another discussion. But the question is, why does Abraham think that even if the servant is going to be successful in his mission, that Yitzchak is going to agree to marry this girl? Right? Where is, there's no mention that Yitzchak is in the room and Abraham has spoken to Yitzchak. Yitzchak sends Yaakov to Haran to find a wife. There's no intermediary. Here, even if we were to say, as the Torah will tell us later on, that Yitzchak's not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael by divine command, but okay, that's fine. So Abraham should say, okay, we have to send the servant when I'm not sending you, but Yitzchak should at least be giving his approval. And that's not, that doesn't appear here at all. The Ramban in source number 2 is aware of this, and the Ramban gives 2 different answers as to try to explain what happened to Yitzchak. So the one is, I think, the answer that most of us probably would have given on our own, namely, Kevan sheishbia to Eved hazeh. This is source number 2 on the sheet for those people, and I hope that it's on the screen. I can't, if there's a shared screen, the Benot Sherut there. Okay, so you'll have to take my word for it, and you have the Makorot. You can all look at the email and look it on your screen if you don't have it in front of you. V'kevan shehishbiya et ha'eved al zeh, lo hutzrach litzavot et Yitzchak davar, ki yodea bo shelo ya'avor al ritzon aviv. So once the Eved has taken an oath, so then there's no need for the Ramban says there's no need to bring Yitzchak in anymore, because Yodea bo shelo ya'avor ritzon aviv. Avraham knows Yitzchak, and he knows that Yitzchak will be a good little tatala and do whatever Avraham tells him to do. So if Avraham has found a wife for him, Yitzchak will go along. So that's answer number one. A very clear, strong, patriarchal type of relationship that exists between Avraham and Yitzchak, even though Yitzchak is, of course, at this point, 40 years old. And Yitzchak the Ramban says that he'll listen. The second answer is really remarkable, in my opinion anyway. You can judge for yourselves. The Ramban has a far more complex way of looking at it than we would normally think. And the second answer, the Ramban says, Gam yitachen, it is also possible. Shahaya ha'eved apotropos al nechasav. The Eved was the guardian, the Eved was the trustee of the estate. V'tziva oto shiasi Yitzchak lirtzono. And so Avraham doesn't have to talk to Yitzchak, because Avraham talks to the person who is controlling the purse strings. V'yanchil oto nechasav al minatken. Avraham tells the Eved, the Ramban says, that if Yitzchak agrees, so then he gets the estate, and if he doesn't, he's written out of the will. That's the deal, right? And the Eved is the person. That's not the way that we normally think of the relationship, if we think about the relationship between the Avot. But basically, it's Abraham is playing hardball with Yitzchak. Either it's my way or the highway, and that's the way it is. And in either scenario, and of course, the Ramban's way of looking at it would perhaps be more acceptable, both approaches, in the when the Ramban was writing it in the 13th century, in the Middle Ages, than it plays in Peoria today, right? So today, in the 21st century, we wouldn't necessarily be too appreciative of this approach. But okay, that would seem to be the idea, namely that it's the parents who decide, even at the age of 40, and the children, either because of, we'll say, out of devotion to their parents, or because of economic concerns, will toe the line, right? One way or the other. That's the way the Ramban is approaching the question. This should be taken into, I think, into perspective based on another Ramban much earlier in the Torah. Back at the very beginning of Sefer Bereshit in Perek Bet, with the creation of Adam and Chava. So the Torah, after telling us how Chava was taken from the Tzela, the Torah tells us, Al ken ya'azov ish et aviv ve'et imo. It is for this reason that a person leaves, it can even be stronger, abandons, but leaves his parents, v'davak bi'ishto, and cleaves to his wife, v'hayu levasar echad, and are of one flesh. Those last two words, levasar echad, so it's not clear what the Torah is meaning. It's hard to believe that the Torah is simply talking about a sexual, not even romance, a sexual relationship that exists between male and female, which is of course common to just about all animals in nature. And the Ramban is aware of that as well. The Rashi, if you take a look at at Rashi, he gives a completely different answer. Rashi and Chazal that he's working off of say they form the basar echad is their issue, their children. That they come together to form a form new children. Be that as it may, the Ramban's answer is the following. If you take a look at the source number 4, so the Ramban says that as opposed to other animals who couple and the animal, the female becomes pregnant, is impregnated, and the male goes off, and there isn't a family structure. So here, when it comes to humanity, so we have a different kind of structure, right? Namely, Husam tivo betoldotav. The Ramban says in the second line of the source number 4, Husam tivo betoldotav. It is this imprint has been placed in our genetic makeup. Liyot hazcharim mehem dveikim b'nishotehem, that the male will cling to the wife, namely ozvim et avihem ve'et imam. So here they leave, and it's not clear whether it's referring to both the Zecharim and the Nekevot, or just the Zecharim, right? Perhaps the women, perhaps by the psychological makeup, retain stronger bonds to their parents. Be that as it may, whether the Ramban is referring to both Zecharim and the Kibud or just the Zecharim, Ozvim et avihem ve'et imam, they leave their father and their mother, V'ro'im et nishotehen ki'ilu hein imam lebasar echad, and view their wives as being of one flesh with them, namely, and then the Ramban brings several psukim to talk about how the term basar, achinu bisarenu, meaning the family unit, it's a new unit. V'hinei ya'azov she'er aviv v'imo v'kurvatam v'yireh she'ishto krova lo mehem. What's the idea of and this is not only, if you will, an ideal, this is what is expected from our basic genetic makeup, the Ramban is saying, is that the younger generation will leave the parents, create a new family unit, and then as a result, the relationship between husband and wife, between the two spouses, is supposed to be a stronger relationship than the relationship that they share with their families before they were married. And that the relationship they have with their parents is now a secondary relationship, and their primary relationship is the relationship that they share with one another, and they have become, and I think is important. It's not that they've become it's not a partnership, it's not even a couple, they've become a unit, they've become a family, one holistic whole that is where their primary concerns are for one another as opposed to the rest of their family circle. This creates, of course, a certain amount of tension, and the Midrash is aware of this. In Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, number 5 here, the Midrash asks the rhetorical question: "V'chi yazov ish et aviv ve'et imo mitzvat kaved." How can you say that a person leaves his father, leaves his mother, and leaves in effect the mitzvah of Kibud av ve'em as a result? How could that be? Ella shahavat nafsho davka acharishta. So the answer is that you don't leave the mitzvah of Kibud, but at the same time, the love of your life is now your spouse. Until you marry, if you feel the love of your childhood, your primary relationship is to your parents. But now that you've moved on to a different home, so then you still have a mitzvah of kavod, but it's a mitzvah. Your dveikut is to your spouse. That's the way that the Midrash works. But the Midrash doesn't really explain how it's supposed to work. In other words, now, and what I'd like to do in the course of the time that we have left over the course of the next hour or so, is to look at, hopefully we'll get to both of them, two two aspects of this, two case studies, if you will, where the conflicting needs of one generation and the older generation come into contrast, come into conflict, and how does halacha deal with that? Here it's a question of the first case study, hopefully that we will cover, is the question of parental objections to a potential spouse. How seriously does a child have to take their parents' concerns and objections to heart when choosing a spouse? And the second case study is once there is a spouse, what to do, right? When hopefully it never happens, but I've heard that it happens. That sometimes there is some tension between in-laws and their children's spouses. It's it's a hypothetical, I know. Some of you might have to strain your imaginations to even get your heads wrapped around that concept, but you'll humor me. So that is the second aspect, where the question of when a spouse wants something and against the parent's wish, who is the spouse supposed to listen to? The parent or their spouse? Yeah.
Does polygamy enter into this concept?
So today it doesn't, I hope. Interestingly enough, when it's being spoken about, at least that I've seen in the poskim, the question of multiple wives did not come up. When in the, if you will, in the Rishonim and the Achronim, this isn't for now, but historically speaking, polygamy is a rarity in Jewish circles, even in under Muslim rule. It's not nearly as prevalent as, it's not unheard of, but it's not nearly as prevalent as it is in the surrounding Arab society. And certainly in Ashkenazic communities, it doesn't exist. And if you go back even earlier than that, I am unaware of a single instance, and if anyone can correct me, I'll be very happy to hear. But I am unaware of a single instance where there is a description in the Gemara or in the Mishnah or the Tosefta, rabbinic literature, of a Tana or an Amora who had two wives.
Like going back to Chumash, Rachel and Leah, and so on.
Right. No. Yes. Certainly in Tanakh you find it, but though how often it's hard to know, because there are plenty of times where it seems to be that there's only a single wife. But you have Elkanah and Chana and Pnina as well in the Kufa of the Shoftim. You have certainly the kings themselves have multiple wives and all of the issues that are there. But in terms of, as I said, if you will, in terms of the it's in the Gemara, in the Mishnah, etc. So there are discussions of multiple wives in the society that exists, but there isn't, to the best of my knowledge, a single instance where we know of a Tana or an Amora who had two wives, which is indicative that even though in practice it could happen, but it was a relatively rare type of occurrence, and it was also something that wasn't necessarily smiled upon in society. It was something that that society as a whole was moving away from. But in terms of the discussion, it's an excellent question, but I'm unaware of anyone who talks about it. It doesn't come up in the discussion. So here, I want to, we'll here in the case study number 1, parental objections to a potential spouse, on the bottom half of the first sheet. So so here the tshuva number 3, there is an earlier tshuva of the Rashba, which I didn't bring, but it was a similar idea. But the one who mentions it most fully is the Maharik. And the Maharik, Rav Yosef Kolon, he lived in the 15th century. He's born about 1420, and in just over on the French side of the Italian-French border today, but just on the French side there. But most of his life he lived in Italy. He's arguably the most influential Italian halachic figure throughout history. There are others who could make the claim, so I won't say unequivocally, but he's certainly in the top 2 or 3. And his influence on Ashkenazic Psak, is very, very important, because many of the Shuvot of his are quoted by the Ramah to when the Ramah argues or adds to the Shulchan Aruch. He's living approximately 100 years or so before the Ramah, and so he has this tshuva which is brought lahalacha by the Ramah. We'll see that the Ramah brings it. Maybe we'll take a look first at the Ramah. If you take a look at number 4, so the Shulchan Aruch, it's Yoredeya Siman Reish Mem. At the very end of Siman Reish Mem in Hilchot Kibud Aveim. So the Shulchan Aruch says the following: Talmid, a student, Shirotze lalechet lemakom acher. Student who wants to go to a place. Shehu boteach shireh siman bracha b'talmudo lifnei harav shesham. A student wants to go to a particular yeshiva. At that time, there aren't the network of yeshivot that we're familiar with. Yeshivot were local affairs. You would learn in your community with a particular, wherever you grew up, there was a local yeshiva, and maybe you would go a few kilometers away to the next town or whatever it is, the most important town in the overall area, and you'd study there. The idea of yeshivot, where central yeshivot that are gathering people from a large area. The first most famous one is, of course, Volozhin. So that's much later, and that's in the 19th century. And a good argument can be made historically is that those yeshivot, which are the yeshivot that we're familiar with, which are the descendants of Volozhin, are cropping up because of the tumultuous change that Jewish society is undergoing in the 19th century. The hometowns are no longer a safe environment. And there are other factors. You also have the ease of travel, and you have, relatively speaking, roads are better. You're going to have the railroad that is being introduced in the 19th century, so you can travel farther away more readily. But basically, when the Shulchan Aruch is writing this, so he's writing it because relatively few people are going to travel far afield to go learn. Certainly, as a student, they might go after they've finished their training, and then to find a job somewhere, they might need, as a Rav, they might need to go to another community. But here, in terms of the learning, so most people are learning close to home. And you have an individual who wants to go learn with another rabbinic figure. He knows that the yeshiva in a different town, being led by a different rabbinic figure, that's the better yeshiva for him. And he wants to go. And his parents, va'aviv mocheba, l'fi shedoeg sheba'oto ha'ira ovdei kochavim ma'alilim. The reason why the father, here it's based on an earlier tshuva of the Rishonim, is that basically the father objects because of the well-being of the son on a physical level. The town where that other yeshiva is located is a town where there have been pogroms, where Jews are not as safe and as secure as they are at home, whether that's in the imagination of the parent, because things that are better the devil I know than the devil I don't, or it's because of actual statistically that it's true. But the parents are very wary about this move, and the son wants to go because of the prestige of the yeshiva. Ein tzarich lishma la'aviv bazeh. So the Shulchan Aruch says that you're allowed to go and learn at the yeshiva that you think. This is a contemporary of the Shulchan Aruch, the Mabit, who is a slightly younger contemporary, living in Tzfat, he actually took over for the Beit Yosef as the Rosh Yeshiva in Tzfat when the Beit Yosef passed away. So the Mabit gives an explanation for this based on the idea that here it's a question of going to. I'm sorry, I take that back. This it's also a yeshiva issue, but it's a go back one step. I'm sorry, apologize. It's not the Mabit, it's the Trumat Hadeshen, which I didn't put on the sheet. Trumat Hadeshen, what he's based on, is basically saying that the Trumat Hadeshen is writing this in the early 15th century in Germany, and you can understand this is, as I said, the question of safety and pogroms and the like. This is right after the Black Death and all of the anti-Jewish rioting that occurred because of that. So here, the rationale that the Trumat Hadeshen gives is that a person has to care about his spiritual well-being, and where you will grow in Torah is very subjective, and not everyone can grow in to their fullest and reach their fullest potential in any given yeshiva. So that spiritual growth is something which pushes aside the mitzvah of Kibud Av Ve'em under these circumstances. That's the Shulchan Aruch. On that line, and I read the piece of the Shulchan Aruch because it's important to understand the context that the Ramah decides to quote the Maharik, and we're going to read the Maharik inside. But first, the one line that the Ramah gives, namely, "V'chein ima'av moche beben lisa ezo isha shiachbotz bahaben ein tzarich lishmor alav." The same way that a son can, perhaps respectfully, but disregard the parental advice when it comes to choice of a yeshiva, in the same way, the Ramah says, a child can marry the woman that he desires and does not have to listen to his father. That's all the Ramah says. He says, without explaining. Now, you could say that in the context of the Ramah, and that's why I read the Shulchan Aruch, that he's saying it's based on the development of the person. It was the same way that I can only hope to develop in a Torah way based on being in the right environment, with the right Rav, etc. So my life can only develop if I'm with the right woman. And so that concern overrides the chiyuv of kibud av ve'em in this case. I don't know if overrides is necessarily the right verb. It could be that I should say takes precedence over. In other words, I have to balance the two, and this one takes precedence. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look, though, at the way that the Maharik himself phrases his answer. He starts with here at number 3, Va'asher, at the bottom of the first page, Va'asher nistapakta im yesh koach biyad ha'av limchot biyad beno lisa isha asher yachbotz ba haben lefi ani udati nireh she'im hi isha ha'hogenet lo ein koach biyad ha'av limchot biyad haben. So he says that if there is a caveat here, if this is a woman who is befitting him, hogenet lo, So then the father cannot stop. Now, of course, that could very well be the argument between father and son, is that the son thinks that this woman is hogenet, and the father thinks that she'd be a disaster. And that's what the whole argument is. That it's not that I agree with you. If it's the isha hogenet, I wouldn't be arguing with you. It's not an isha she'ena hogenet. So that could be the question. But now the Maharik gives three explanations as to why this is the case. This is what's important. The Maharik gives three explanations to this, and he says the following. Chada, first reason, da'afilu, and these are the 3 bullet points. Chada, da'afilu le'inyan mamon, o dilei rabbanan le'Rabbi Yirmiyah keman da'amar mishel av, v'chein pasku kol poskei halachot asher ra'iti. So he says, he references, I'm not going to read, if you're interested, just very briefly, I brought in sources 2 and 3, the background here. I'm not going to, 1 and 2. I'm not going to read them inside right now, but there's a question, a basic question in Hilchot Kibud Reeim. Who foots the bill? It's true that I have to, as a son, provide for the service to the parent. But who has to pay for that service? In other words, if I'm if the parent, just to take just the simplest example, ma'achilo umashkehu. So the son is supposed to feed and provide food and drink for the parent. Who is supposed to pay for the food? Is it Mishel Av or Mishel Ben? Is it from the father's? Is it from the parent's bank account? Or is it from the son's bank account? Of course, it gets more complicated. What happens if one side or the other can't afford the expenses? But assuming now everything is equal and both sides could be providing for it, in principle, whose responsibility is it? It's a machloket amongst the Amoraim. And he says, and this is clearly the psak, which is accepted, I believe, without any argument, that the base of the Gemara, that it's Mishel Av, that the financial responsibility for the services that a parent receives is the parent's responsibility. As long as the parent can afford to pay for whatever care he or she needs, the child, it's incumbent upon the child to make sure that the care is given. It's incumbent upon the child even to provide the care personally. But the cost has to be borne by the parent. So the Maharik quotes this halacha, and he says, if this is true when it comes to the financial burden, he says something really remarkable. Kol shechen, all the more so here, shehu davar hashayach b'tzara degufa. So now we are talking not about a monetary loss. We're talking about a deep emotional, psychological loss. Namely, lahaniach isha asher chafetz ba v'yitzarech lakachat isha acheret asher lo tishar be'einav kol kach. If you have to give up the love of your life in order to marry someone else, so that loss is far greater, he says, than any financial burden that I can imagine. And the psychological cost is also Mishel Av and not Mishel Ben. If I don't demand that the son pay for the dinner that the mother is receiving, I certainly shouldn't expect the son, or for that matter, the daughter, to pay in psychological coin to be married to a person who is not their bechir libo. That is the first argument of the Maharik. Now, I'm not going to take this further right now because I want to get to the second case study as well. But I haven't seen people quoting this per se, but this is a a tremendous, if you think about it, a very important idea that the Maharik is putting forward here. Because what the Maharik in effect is saying is that it has ramifications to what is unfortunately a question that comes up. Does a child in an abusive relationship have a responsibility of Kibud Av, Reeim? Questions that have been dealt with by the poskim over the course of the last 20, 30 years, and is still really developing as society is developing in these questions. To what extent, for example, just a question that is asked to Rav Zilberstein in the beginning of the century, or the current century, the 21st century, where if you are in a counseling session and the child has been abused in one way or another, and as a result, in the session, in the psychological counseling that this person is receiving, he or she has to speak badly of the parent. There might be a need for the child to break ties with the parent because of whatever has occurred in the past and what is continuing now. So, and that is on prima facie a violation of Kibud Av Reeim. So, do you say that the child has to basically suck it up, as it were, and maybe not grin, but bear it? That is so there are those who say that, which is very difficult. And as I said, it's a shirin of itself, because there are many different aspects to this, and perhaps in the future we'll deal with it. But if you take this Maharik, so this Maharik, I think, would tell you right away that, if with all due respect to the idea of wanting to marry the person you want to live with the rest of your life, as opposed to the Taylor Muttelkamp soil, as it were, as opposed to the butcher laser wolf. Okay, that's a very difficult thing to force on Zeitel. Okay, we get it. At the same time, the questions of abuse are far greater than that. And to force, Rahmana litzlan, a person to be in an abusive relationship because of Kibud Av Reeim, so then you are demanding far more than anything that the child would have to pay for when it comes to the normal expenses. And so taking this Maharik, I think that you can use this as a very strong source to be saying that under these circumstances, Kibud Av Reeim, there are other reasons as well, but Kibud Av Reeim is at best in a very far back seat when it comes to the child's mental health. Yeah. You're on mute, Phil. Phil, I can't hear you. All right, when you figure it out, you'll let us know. But right now, you're still on mute. Okay, so let's continue now to the second idea of there you are.
The question is, how much of this is religious dictate, halacha, or psychological and practicality? It's a very different type of question between what bracha you should make. This is human behavior, and you can find one rabbi says this, one rabbi says that. Is that halacha?
I think that the halacha, the idea, and this is the idea that already being brought back to that source that I read earlier, when it came to the Pirkei de Rabbi Elazar, that is very much, when it comes to Kibud Av Reeim, the psychology, the society, the expectations in the family are all major components of Hilchot Kibud Av Reeim.
Yeah.
Or it's even, so you might get different answers based on different people's viewpoints, But but that is what Kibud Av V'em is all about. You hit the nail on the head. The mitzvah itself is one where psychology and relationships don't only play a role, they are at the heart of the mitzvah, and on many different levels. I mean, this could be another shir in of itself. But the Gemara, for example, and the Yerushalmi gives a very detailed description. Gemara says that you can feed your parent the finest pheasant is the food of choice there, and violate Kibud Av V'em, or you can make him work like a dog and be Mekayim mitzvah Kibud Av V'em. And the example, the way that the Yerushalmi explains it, is that if you throw the food on the plate and basically say, okay, take your food, old man, and you do it in a disrespectful manner, so then you violated Kibud Av V'em. You've given him the best food, but if what we've probably all told our children, and we all heard from our parents, right? Standard parent line number 6, right? It's not what you say, it's how you say it, right? So it's true. That's the halacha. So if you are speaking disrespectfully, even if you are being mekayim the mitzvah in terms of the material chiyuv, you violated Kibud Av V'em. And on the other,
basically, it turns the mitzvah into a concentration of what is morally correct.
Absolutely.
But
absolutely.
But that is what any decent person should do. It's sort of different than a mitzvah that we don't know the reason for, but this is what we do.
Correct. But at the same time, what every decent person would do. The question is, where are the limitations? In other words, I'll give an example from another area of halacha and of life entirely. Any decent person will tell you that murder is wrong. Okay? So, okay. But what about euthanasia? Okay. What about abortion under certain circumstances? Under what circumstance? In other words, Kibud Av V'em, yes, of course, every decent person will tell you should honor your parents. Right? That is clear. But when you hit situations like the ones that we're dealing with now, where the mitzvah of kavod comes into conflict with other legitimate aspects of people's lives, the priority question then becomes much thornier.
Yes.
So that is really where what we're focusing on. So there are many of those issues, and so we have to try to figure out. So by saying, for example, that the mitzvah of Kibud Av V'em is not absolute, and that there isn't on the financial level, it's primarily the responsibility of the parent to provide for himself or herself, and it's the child's responsibility to help the parent to make sure that the parent receives what he or she needs. That is the breakdown, but it's not the child's responsibility to pay for it. So the Maharik says, I could extend that concept. This is the Chiddush of the Maharik. The Gemara only talks about the financial side, but the Maharik is saying, well, it's a principle that's at play. And the principle that's at play here is that the child isn't expected to pay too high a price. And so if I care about the financial price, so then I certainly care about the emotional, psychological price that a child might have to pay. That's the first answer of the Maharik.
This all depends on what the thinking of the time is. And it's not in the same category as an absolute statement that this is the halacha, that's it.
I agree with you. And we're going to see that in just another 2 minutes, I hope, maybe 10 minutes when we reach another source. But let's continue in the Maharik. So the Maharik now, the second bullet point, as to explain this. So he says the following: Va'od de karova davar be'enai liyot k'mitzvah la'avor al divrei Torah. Shaharei amru rabotenu asur la'adam she'ikadesh et ha'isha ad she'irena. There's another limitation to Kibud Avim. A parent is never allowed, or he's allowed to, but we won't listen to him, or we'll tell the child not to listen to him, if the parent demands that the child violate halacha in some way or another. So if the child, as long as the Gemara uses the following explanation, the father and the mother, they also have the same chiyuv. The Torah says, Ish aviv v'imo tirau, Ish imo v'aviv tirau, ve'ed shabtotai tishmoru. So you should fear your parent, but you should keep the Shabbat, Ani Hashem Elokechem. That's the pasuk. So the Chazal understood from this that the reason why Shabbat is introduced together with Kibud Avim was because the parent also has a responsibility to keep Shabbat. Halacha is something which is incumbent upon every Jew. So the parent's authority reaches the limit of not violating God's authority. So if the parent were to demand that the child violate halacha in some manner, shape, or form, then kavod doesn't apply. That, by the way, is one of the rationales that's given for what we were discussing before with regard to the Torah question. Studying Torah, because again, it's taking it into the positive sphere. It's not only a question that I violate. I mean, I'm not violating bitul Torah if I learn in yeshiva X as opposed to yeshiva Y. You want me to be in yeshiva Y, I want to be in yeshiva X. But if the quality of the Torah is going to be violated, because I will learn better, I think I'll learn better in yeshiva X, so then I don't have to listen to my parent when he tells me to stay in yeshiva Y, because he, in a sense, is telling me to violate the halacha, not to fulfill it in its best way. Similarly, when it comes to a spouse, so there's a mitzvah you're not allowed, the Gemara says, you're not allowed to marry without having met the potential spouse at least once. And the reason why the Gemara says is because v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. So it's true, we all know that, and the Gemara probably knew it even better than we do. We all understand that, I tell my children, I tell my students, you don't even begin to know how a marriage is going to work until you have children. Right? And that's the point where you really have to work together, and you really have to see how, and halacha doesn't allow us to first have children and then get married. So we understand there are limitations, but at the same time, because of ahavta l'reacha kamocha, so we don't want to have a situation of bait and switch. First impressions are very important as well. So if you find the potential spouse, even at the first meeting, to be someone who is just someone that you don't see you're being able to live the rest of your life with, so then you're going to be in violation of ahavta l'reacha kamocha. There's going to be a lot of tension in that marriage. So therefore it becomes usher to marry without having met the bride first, right, or the bride meeting the groom. That's the idea.
Rav Susman, wasn't this Avram? According to Rashi, Avram never looked at Sarah until he came to Paro. There's a problem there halachically. He never looked at her.
Could be.
He kept his eyes shut.
Right. Well, okay, we'll take that under consideration, Paul. So so now but by the way, it could very well be that when at the end of our parsha, when Rivka falls off the camel in her meeting with Yitzchak, so what would have happened if Yitzchak had looked at her, or Rivka had looked at him, and said, no, this is not going to work, right? So they would have had that right to do so. From a straight halachic perspective, even that. By the way, there are exceptions to that rule. There's a very tragic Tosfot on that Gemara. Tosfot talks about how there are times it's also a question of the age of a marriage, that basically because of the Crusades we don't necessarily have the luxury of these things. We want people to be married so that homes can be created and families can be created, and the Tosfot is saying there are times that these considerations become almost luxuries. Right? You read the Tosfot and it breaks your heart when you're reading the Tosfot, because you're reading between the lines and you're understanding what kind of terrible circumstances they're talking about. But be that as it may, so the Maharik says if it's usher to marry a woman because sight unseen, because that could create tension, and that's potentially going to violate V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, then certainly it's usher to marry someone who you know from the get-go that is not the person that you want to marry.
But she's rich.
Oh, okay. So you might be willing to compromise, right?
No.
I won't tell that to Fegi, but I'm just saying you might be willing to compromise, okay? But it's but at the same time, your father can't compromise for you. That's the idea. He's saying, I don't want to marry this person, but you want to marry her so that there's going to be some kind of business relationship between the two families, right? That's your problem. That's not my problem.
That becomes the halachic position.
Right.
And you can cite it if you have a problem. That's what I was looking for.
Right.
Because the common sense we know, but the final thing that is halachic has to be a statement that we believe that ultimately comes from the divine.
Okay, but again, the divine made us, and the divine also created the Akenya Azov Ishat Aviv Ve'etimo V'davak B'ishto. Right, so the Ribono Shalom is well aware of we'll say, the complexity of human relations, and the complexity is made all the more complex when you're dealing with, with the problem of I shouldn't say the problem, but the potential conflict between parent-child in-law. Okay, so all of that needs to be taken into consideration. The last reason of the Maharik, this is the third bullet point, and the Maharik, by the way, the second point also has ramifications to other halachic areas. So, for example, the Mabit, which I referred to earlier, but I'm not going to read it now inside because of the time. But the Mabit, his question is, well, can there was a situation where the parents did not want the child to make aliyah. This is in the 16th century. So can the parent stop a child from making aliyah? And the Mabit says, no, this is a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that's incumbent on the parent too. And if the parent is concerned that they're not going to receive proper care because the child is moving away, then they can make aliyah also. That's the way the Mabit said. Now, what would the Mabit say is objectively, and this is where there are certain instances here where there isn't a definitive answer, and each case really does have to be worked out case by case. What would happen if the parent is unable to make aliyah for very clear physical limitations, or because of financial considerations that just can't be changed? And so then, where he's saying glibly almost, okay, let the parent make aliyah too. Under those circumstances, would we still say that the parent can stop a child from making aliyah or not? I have an acquaintance who they made aliyah after after Parshat Lech Lecha. So they made a kiddush in the shul for the likrat the aliyah, and the father got up and said, it's Parshat Lech Lecha, and it's so appropriate that they're going to Israel, and said, but am I terach? Right? It was a terrible thing. Am I terach? They're leaving me? How could they do this to me? Right? It's it was a very awkward moment when the parent did that. So under those circumstances, so it's not so simple. We all understand it's not that simple. So, but this basic idea that the limitations of Kibud Av Ve'em are reach the line of violating halacha. But then the question is, well, what is violating halacha? Certain things, it's, again, the yeshiva question is sort of a gray area. I'm not telling you not to learn Torah. I'm just telling you to learn in this yeshiva. The Eretz Yisrael question is, there are a lot of legitimate reasons why, and again, these change from generation to generation. And thank God in our generation, there are fewer reasons to allow for someone not to think about not making aliyah than there were a couple of generations ago. But still, there are legitimate reasons even today why a person might not make aliyah. So it's not like saying I'm telling you to eat treif. So it's so that has to be taken into consideration. The third answer now of the Maharik, the third bullet point, is the one which is the broadest and the one which is frequently quoted. I remember it being quoted to me when I was in high school many, many moons ago. But it has its own question marks. The third idea of the Maharik is that is the following. At the top of the second sheet, the lo shayach kavod ela kagon ma'achilo mashkeo malbisho manilo. So what is kavod? Kavod is the actively providing the parents' needs. Feeding, drink, clothing, etc. Mora, there's the ish of imo va'aviv tira'u. It's lo yeshev bimkomo. You shouldn't sit in his place. Lo soteret varav. Right? Our children never contradict us because of this pasuk of lo, ish, and we've never contradicted our parents. V'chein ki yotzeh b'zeh. However, the shayach la'av. What is Kibud Horim? Dealing directly with the parents' needs and concerns. But but if you're talking about something which is not directly an issue of the parent, but is really a question of the child, then then the father or the parent doesn't have the right to object and to stop the child from fulfilling their desire. So now you can extend this quite broadly, right? You can say, going back to the time where we were told, right, that, by our mothers, put on a sweater, I'm cold, right? So do you have to put on the sweater? Or do you have to, so most of us put on the sweater and then took it off when we went outside. But does she even have the right to demand mitzat kibud av ve'em to put on the sweater? You could read this Maharik and say no. There's you're cold, so put on your sweater. I'm not cold, I don't have to put on my sweater. That's you can understand the Maharik that way as well. You could, if it's a question of not a spouse, but let's say a professional decision. I'm making a decision to take a job somewhere where I won't see the parent as nearly as much as I would if I took a job close to home. Not a question of moving to Israel necessarily. It's a question of just going from one country to another or one city to another, etc. So can the parents stop me from doing that? So I could make an argument that the parent isn't able to under those circumstances, because again, it's my professional decision for my own life, and the fact that it will have a ripple effect, that is not that doesn't touch upon Kibud Av Ve'em. But of course, just taking that last example, there the question is how strong a ripple is it? right? Is it a ripple or is it a wave? Because if I'm unable, there's a I don't know if it's a whether it's a true story or not, but it's a good story of someone who came to Rav Chaim of Brisk. This is after there was the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and said to him that he lives far away from his parents, and he's willing to visit his parents if they buy the ticket. They buy the train ticket, he'll come and visit, but they're not willing to pay for the ticket, right? So he's not willing to go. So Rav Chaim is said to have replied, "You're absolutely right. You can walk." Okay, in other words, fine. Okay, you have a responsibility to be there for your parents.
Yeah.
So if you could take the train, take the train. But if you can't take the train, so you still have to be there. You don't have that kind of. So now, if I take a job somewhere and as a result I'm unable to fulfill Kibud Reeim directly, their own needs, so maybe then it does take precedence, the Kibud Reeim. Because you have to look at each case individually to see, are there other children around? What are the needs of the parents? Is it just is a Zoom call enough, or is it something that it's insufficient, etc.? All of these issues are each case has to be viewed individually, and there, as much as a Rav would be posek, he would be hopefully. There's a question of guidance that needs to be have done as well. The person, as I told you, this is going to come up. It took even a little bit more than 10 minutes to reach source number 7. Source number 7 here is the tshuva of the Netziv of the Meshiv Davar at the end of the 19th century, where he puts a very clear limit on the din of the Maharik. And he says the following, Nireh dahadi ita biyaradea v'cheni ma'av mocheba ben nisai zayisha she'ech botzba ein tzarech ben lishmor la'av. So this halacha, which we've been speaking about till now, ze'eno ela ba'ofen she'en be'isha shechafetz ba bizayon v'tzar la'av aval biyesh bizayon asur lisayana. We're only talking about a situation where this will not bring shame and disgrace to the father. But if it will bring, this marriage will bring bizayon and tsar, cause the father deep psychological pain, so then it's forbidden. Now, where did the Netziv get this from? So the Netziv gets it from, it's really it touches upon the complexity of Kibud Reeim, really the complexity that we all recognize in our own personal relationships, whether we're looking in terms of our children and grandchildren, whether we're looking in terms of our parents and their our relationship with them, everyone with their own stage of life. But the complexity is really described, he says, in 3 psukim. The 3 psukim, which we've only spoken about 2 so far. We talked about kaberet avicha v'atimecha. That's the positive chiyuvim that I have to do. Then there is ish imo v'aviv tiro. The yira is the, if you will, the negative side. The awe. I don't sit in their chair. Fine. There's a 3rd pasuk, and the 3rd pasuk, which is here on the first page, I didn't show you at the time, number 8, in terms of the in first section, in Sefer Dvarim, one of the curses that's said in Har Grizim and Har Eval, one of the curses is Arur Makle Aviv V'imo. Cursed is the person who denigrates a parent. So denigration, the Netziv says, that is what he has used the term bizayon and tsar, bringing disgrace upon the parent. So if the child, so he says, when it comes to the question of, well, is it my life, is it your life? So my life, it's not a parent's direct need to receive a It's not a parent's direct need to receive, for me to be marrying person X, Y, or Z. That's true. But it is the parent's direct need not to be humiliated. So if I am acting in a way which humiliates the parent, so then I'm forbidden to do that. And then I'm not allowed to marry the person that I want to marry. Now,
well, one second.
this is,
Can I ask
yeah.
a question?
Sure.
We thank God live in a sandwich generation where we have responsibilities to parents, but also to children. And how often has it come up? Your son's becoming an officer in the army, but your mother's got his 90th birthday. What do you do? Okay, I don't think the halacha or anything gives you an answer to that.
Not a definitive answer. See, all these things are giving you guidelines. Now, the Netziv, by the way, is clearly, he's referring to the Ramah. The Ramah didn't talk about the question of the humiliation and the pain of the child.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's now, if I have to marry, I have a lifetime. Yes, there is going to be, for whatever the reason, she comes from the wrong family, whatever it is. So yes, it's a violation. I understand it. At the same time, you're asking me to spend my life with a person or without the person who I truly love. So which of those personal tsars should take precedence? The Netziv is saying the tsar of the father does. I understand that, but it's not so clear. The same token,
the son is going to obey the halacha.
well, maybe not. But the question is first, what is the halacha?
Exactly.
Right. There were hundreds of thousands of people who decided, even though they were basically, if you will, people who we might call traditional Jews, who decided that they had to work on Shabbos because 100 years ago, if you don't show up on Saturday, don't show up on Monday, okay? And they were Mechal Shabbos.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the psak halacha that the rabbi is supposed to give is that you should be Mechal Shabbos? No, this is the psak, and then people will do whatever they do. That's true. Okay, we understand that, and we're not saying necessarily because people chose that. I can certainly sympathize with the people who decided to do that. Right? There's no question. I don't know what I would do under those circumstances.
You can't be mad at them.
I'm certainly not mad at them, right? And I know people who are very dear to me, people of my great aunts, great uncles, who made that decision, right? But and then at a later time became fully Shomer Shabbat when they didn't have to do it anymore. But and others who didn't become fully Shomer Shabbat. But the point though is I can certainly empathize and sympathize with that circumstances, and thank God that I don't live in a time and era where that's a problem. But at the same time, I know what the halacha is.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether I would have been able to withstand the test at that time, but I know what the halacha is. And the same token, he's saying, okay, this is the halacha when it comes to the choice of the spouse. Does that mean that every child is going to be willing to do it? Does that mean the majority of children are going to be willing to do it? I don't know. But that's the halacha. Now, I would think that the Netziv would agree that what is considered, right, the Netziv is talking about the generation of Fiddler on the Roof.
Yeah.
Right? So fine. So they gave each other a pledge, right? This is what's going on, right? This is how unthinkable, right? So under those circumstances, right? So there you can go on the one hand. On the other hand, there is no other hand. I get that. That's in the end of the 19th century, right? But what happens today? Does it change? What is considered to be is there any, I think there is a line, right? Speaking now as a parent, right? There's going to be a line which is bizayon v'tsar, today as well. That line for us today is very different than the line that it was 120 years ago, or 130 years ago when the Netziv was writing this tshuva. It might be different from one community to the next. In other words, I'm sitting here in the yeshiva in Givat Mordechai, right? There might be a couple of blocks away from me in Givat Mordechai or in Bayit Vagan, where people have very different social sensibilities than I have. And what's bizayon b'tzar for me is not what's bizayon b'tzar for them in their families. So under those circumstances, what might not be a chiyuv of kibud avim for my children is a chiyuv of kibud avim, perhaps the Netziv would say, for children from those families. And then you might have to ask the question within the family itself. In other words, if okay, I'm not going to get to the second case study, so I'll just, I remember very deeply, this is obviously there are other halachic issues that are involved. When I was 7 years old, I remember it as though it happened yesterday. So a second cousin of mine married out. Fine. And it was a scandal in the family. And my mother and grandmother, Zichronam Livracha, were talking about it. And my mother, they were so upset that my cousin was marrying, and it's no longer politically correct to say this, right? It's not a nice word, but marrying a shiksa. Now, I was 7. And I looked at them having this, and I asked my mother, I said, so he's marrying a maid. What's so terrible? Because every week the shiksa was coming to the house to clean the house. I assumed that the word shiksa meant the maid, right? So I couldn't understand why everyone was so upset about this. The point is that for some families, yes, if it was just if it's a question of just different socioeconomic standings, so it can for certain families bring bizayon b'tzar to the family. It could be but I think today most families that's not an issue anymore. Right. So again, depending on this is what is so incredible about this halacha, and this might be very much why Chazal said that the most difficult halacha to keep, the most difficult mitzvah, is kibud avim, because there are so many different aspects of the halacha, and it is so complex, and it deals with the heart of human relationships, and it is a moving target. From one family to the next, from one society to the next, from one generation to the next. There aren't the most that you can do is give the guidelines and understand the basic principles. And then each family, each generation has to work it out on their own. So Yitzchak had to work it out with Abraham. And why was Yitzchak going to listen to the Eved? Maybe the Ramban's reasons are correct, or maybe there were other considerations that Yitzchak had for himself. We have to understand our relationships with our children and know also what limits that we should set for them. That's something that I didn't talk about too much, but is obviously very important. In other words, it's not only what parents feel isn't a given also. Parents, same way that we can expect children to, if you will, to be flexible, we can also expect parents to be flexible and to be understanding of what their children's needs are. But it goes back and forth. The psak of the Ramah, and this is why I think the Netziv is so important. I just recently taught this tshuva to my Talmidim, and I said this is exactly the complexity of Kibud Avim. You can just read the Ramah and say, it's my life, let me live my life. But you have to realize that your life is also, to a certain extent, your parents' lives. and you have to be sensitive to your parents' lives, and they have to be sensitive to your lives. And that's the only way that everyone can be Mekayem, all these mitzvot, Kehilchata.
Amen.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shikar.